What did the American soldier really think of the man in the field grey uniform across the wire? Not the newsreel version, not the propaganda poster villain with a monocle and a sneer, but the actual German soldier who dug the foxhole 50 yards away, who fired the machine gun that pinned a platoon down for 6 hours, who surrendered with his hands raised and a photograph of his children in his breast pocket. For 4 years, from the sands of North Africa to the ruins of the Ruhr, millions of American GIs formed opinions about their enemy that were far more complicated than anything printed in a government pamphlet. Some of those opinions were shaped by terror. Some were shaped by grudging respect. Some were shaped by disgust so total it never faded for the rest of a man's life. And some, strangely enough, were shaped by a kind of soldierly kinship that crossed the battle lines entirely, a recognition that the boy in the different uniform was, in some fundamental way, just another young man trying to survive a war neither of them had started. In this video, we will find out how American soldiers actually saw the German army, unit by unit, campaign by campaign, from the first shots fired in Tunisia to the final collapse in the spring of 1945. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. When American troops landed in North Africa in November of 1942, most of them had never fired a shot in anger. Operation Torch put Green divisions fresh from the training camps of Georgia and Texas up against a German force that had already spent nearly 2 years fighting in the desert, and the difference showed almost immediately. At the Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, elements of the US Army's 1st Armored Division and the 34th Infantry Division collided with veteran units of the Afrika Korps under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. And the result was a humiliating defeat that cost the Americans over 6,000 casualties and dozens of tanks. It was here, in the chaos of that first real battle, that American soldiers began forming their earliest impressions of the German fighting man, and those impressions were not flattering to themselves. Private first-class accounts collected after the war described German artillery observers who seemed to know exactly where American positions were before the shooting even started, German panzer crews who maneuvered with a precision that looked almost mechanical, and German infantry who advanced under fire with a discipline that unnerved men who had never seen combat before. One veteran of the 168th Infantry Regiment later recalled that the Germans moved like they had rehearsed it 100 times. And in a sense, they had. Many of the German units in North Africa had trained together for years under a doctrine that emphasized initiative at every level of command, something the American army would only fully develop later in the war. But Kasserine also planted the seed of a myth that would follow the German army for the rest of the conflict, and beyond it, the myth of Erwin Rommel as the clean, chivalrous warrior, the so-called Desert Fox, who fought a decent war in a war otherwise defined by atrocity. American and British soldiers who fought against the Afrika Korps often spoke of Rommel with something closer to admiration than hatred. Stories circulated in American units about German medical units treating wounded prisoners with genuine care, about Rommel personally ordering that captured enemy soldiers be given water and shade in the brutal desert heat, about a war fought at least in North Africa, with something resembling old-fashioned rules of engagement. Whether this reputation was entirely deserved remains a subject of historical debate. Rommel commanded a force that, unlike the armies fighting in the East, was largely insulated from the ideological war of extermination that defined the Eastern Front, and the Desert Campaign, fought largely without civilian populations caught in the crossfire, allowed for a kind of martial theatre that felt almost anachronistic. General Omar Bradley, who would later command American forces in Europe, reportedly told colleagues that the fighting in North Africa was the last of the gentlemen's wars, a phrase that captured how differently American soldiers viewed the Wehrmacht in the desert compared to how they would come to view certain German formations later in the conflict. It's worth noting that not every American shared this rosy assessment. Many veterans of Kasserine remembered only the humiliation of retreat, the loss of friends, and a Germany army that had simply outfought them in every phase of the battle. The admiration for Rommel, in other words, coexisted uneasily with plain old fear. That fear only intensified as American forces pushed into Sicily and then onto the Italian mainland in the summer and fall of 1943. If North Africa had been a war of maneuver across open desert, Italy was a war of attrition through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe, and it was here that American soldiers developed a deep and lasting respect for the German army's skill at defensive fighting. The Germans, forced into a fighting retreat up the Italian peninsula, proved masters of using terrain to their advantage. Every river crossing became a killing ground. Every mountain pass was mined, wired, and covered by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. At the Gustav Line, anchored around the monastery of Monte Cassino, German paratroopers and mountain troops held off repeated Allied assaults for months, inflicting appalling casualties on American, British, Polish, and French forces alike. American infantrymen who fought through the Italian campaign often described the German soldier in almost professional terms, less as a fanatical ideologue and more as a supremely competent tradesman of violence. One veteran of the 3rd Infantry Division put it simply, they knew their business. This was a recurring theme in American assessments of the Wehrmacht throughout the war, a kind of reluctant professional courtesy extended to an enemy who, whatever else could be said about the regime he served, clearly understood the mechanics of modern combat. But what would happen when American soldiers encountered not the disciplined Wehrmacht regular, but the fanatical true believer of the SS? That distinction, as we will see, mattered enormously to the men doing the fighting. The great test of American perceptions of the German soldier came on June 6, 1944, when the largest amphibious invasion in history put tens of thousands of American troops onto the beaches of Normandy. At Omaha Beach in particular, American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions ran into a nightmare of German defensive engineering that had been years in the making. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's much-touted coastal fortification system, was in truth uneven in its construction, but at Omaha the defenders happened to include elements of the veteran 352nd Infantry Division, a unit that had been quietly moved into the sector shortly before the invasion, and that Allied intelligence had failed to detect. German machine gunners positioned in reinforced bunkers with interlocking fields of fire cut down wave after wave of American infantry as they waded ashore, and for several hours on the morning of June 6th, it appeared entirely possible that the invasion at Omaha would fail outright. Survivors of that first wave described German fire so intense and so accurate that entire boat teams were wiped out before they reached the sand. Private Harry Parley of the 116th Infantry Regiment later recalled watching German tracer rounds walking down the beach like a scythe, cutting through men who had nowhere to hide. For the soldiers who survived Omaha, the German defenders they faced that morning were not chivalrous desert warriors or professional tradesmen of war. They were simply an efficient killing machine, and the terror of that morning shaped how an entire generation of American veterans remembered the German army for the rest of their lives. Yet even amid the horror of Omaha Beach, some of the men who survived it later expressed a kind of bitter admiration for the German gunners who had very nearly stopped the invasion in its tracks. It was, after all, a relatively small number of German defenders who had inflicted such catastrophic casualties on a vastly larger invading force, and American veterans who later studied the battle came to appreciate just how skillfully the German defense had been organized, even if the men who built it were serving a monstrous cause. This tension between respect for German military competence and horror at what that competence was used to accomplish would define American attitudes toward the Wehrmacht for the remainder of the war. As American forces pushed inland from the beaches and became bogged down in the hedgerow country of Normandy, this tension only deepened because the bocage terrain, with its centuries-old earthen embankments and thick hedges dividing every field into a natural fortress, played directly into German defensive strengths. American soldiers fighting through the hedgerows in the weeks after D-Day developed a particular and very specific fear, a fear of one piece of German equipment above almost all others, the dreaded 88mm gun. Originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the German 88 proved devastatingly effective in a ground role, capable of destroying an American Sherman tank at ranges the Sherman's own gun could not hope to match. American tank crews who faced German 88s and the Tiger and Panther tanks that mounted similar high-velocity guns quickly developed a grim nickname for their own vehicles, the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company's advertising slogan that it lights every time, a bitter joke about how easily Sherman tanks burned when struck by German armor-piercing rounds. American armoured crews who survived engagements against German Panthers and Tigers often spoke of the German tanks and their crews with a mixture of terror and technical respect that bordered on obsession. It became common knowledge among American tankers that it typically took several Shermans to knock out a single Tiger, and that the safest tactic was to try to maneuver against the thinner side or rear armour, rather than engage a Tiger head-on. This wasn't cowardice, American soldiers were quick to point out. It was simply math. The Germans had built a better gun and a better armoured vehicle, at least in terms of raw killing power, and American soldiers respected that fact even as they worked out ways to overcome it through numbers, air support, and tactical cunning. Whether it was called the Ronson joke or the grim statistics passed around campfires about how many Shermans it took to kill one Tiger, the fear of German armour became one of the defining features of how American soldiers understood their enemy on the ground in France. Alongside the fear of German tanks came an equally intense fear of a single infantry weapon that American soldiers came to know by an unmistakable and terrifying sound. The MG-42 machine gun, capable of firing over 1,000 rounds per minute, produced a distinctive tearing noise that American soldiers described as sounding less like individual gunshots and more like a piece of canvas being ripped in half. American GIs gave the weapon a nickname that stuck for the rest of the war and beyond: Hitler's buzzsaw, or sometimes simply the Ripper. The rate of fire was so much faster than anything in the American arsenal that soldiers could immediately distinguish German fire from their own simply by the sound alone, and the psychological effect of that sound echoing across a Normandy hedgerow or an Italian mountainside was profound. Veterans interviewed decades after the war still remembered the specific terror the MG-42's sound produced. A fear that went beyond ordinary combat stress into something closer to primal dread. And yet, in the strange logic of soldiers who had to face this weapon and survive it, American infantrymen also developed a technical fascination with the MG-42, studying captured examples, comparing its rate of fire to their own Browning machine guns, and in some cases even preferring to use captured German weapons when the opportunity arose, provided ammunition could be found. As the fighting moved deeper into France in the summer of 1944, American soldiers began to encounter a formation whose reputation had preceded it into battle: the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the most heavily equipped and professionally trained armoured units in the entire German army. Formed from instructor and demonstration units of the German armoured school system, Panzer Lehr represented, in a sense, the very best that German armoured doctrine had to offer. A division whose officers and non-commissioned officers had literally taught the tactics that other panzer divisions practiced. American forces who fought against Panzer Lehr in the fighting around Saint-Lô and later during Operation Cobra found themselves facing an enemy of exceptional tactical skill, and the division's eventual destruction in the massive American bombing that opened Operation Cobra in July of 1944 did nothing to diminish the reputation its survivors had earned among the American soldiers who fought them. General Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded Panzer Lehr, was regarded by American intelligence officers as one of the most capable panzer commanders in the entire German army. And after the war, in a strange twist common to many such stories, Bayerlein cooperated extensively with American historians studying the campaign, offering detailed and often surprisingly candid assessments of both German and American tactics. American officers who interviewed him after the war came away struck by how much genuine professional respect existed between former enemies once the shooting had stopped, a respect that had in fact existed even during the fighting itself, buried beneath the urgency of survival. If Panzer Lehr represented the professional, almost technocratic face of the German army that American soldiers came to respect, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, represented something altogether different and altogether more disturbing. Formed largely from members of the Hitler Youth Organization, boys as young as 16 and 17 who had been raised from childhood on a steady diet of Nazi ideology, the division fought with a fanaticism that shocked even hardened American and Canadian veterans. In the fighting around Caen in June and July of 1944, soldiers of the 12th SS fought with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal, launching attacks that more experienced units would have recognized as hopeless, and defending positions to the last man in situations where surrender would have been the rational choice. Allied soldiers captured by the 12th SS during this period sometimes did not survive captivity. The most notorious incident, the murder of Canadian prisoners of war at the Ardennes Abbey, became a symbol of just how different this formation was from the German army that American soldiers had encountered in North Africa and Italy. American soldiers who fought alongside Canadian forces near Caen absorbed these stories quickly, and the reputation of the 12th SS as fanatical, dangerous, and utterly without the professional restraint that characterized units like Panzer spread rapidly through Allied ranks. Here was the beginning of a distinction that American soldiers would draw again and again as the war progressed. A line between the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, however formidable and however guilty of its own war crimes on other fronts, and the Waffen-SS, whose ideological fanaticism produced a different and more frightening kind of enemy altogether. Was every SS soldier a murderer, and was every Wehrmacht soldier simply a professional doing an ugly job? The reality, as American soldiers would discover again and again, was far messier than any simple label could capture, but the distinction itself became deeply embedded in how the average American GI understood the war he was fighting. That distinction was tested to its breaking point during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, when a German offensive through the Ardennes forest caught American forces almost completely by surprise. At the center of that offensive was Kampfgruppe Peiper, an armored spearhead commanded by SS Colonel Joachim Peiper, one of the most aggressive and, as events would prove, one of the most ruthless commanders in the entire German army. On December 17, 1944, near the Belgian crossroads town of Malmedy, soldiers under Peiper's command shot and killed more than 80 American prisoners of war who had already surrendered, machine-gunning them in a snow-covered field after disarming them. News of the massacre spread through American lines within hours, carried by the handful of survivors who managed to escape by playing dead in the snow and later crawling to American positions. The psychological effect on American soldiers fighting in the Ardennes was immediate and profound. Word went out, informally but unmistakably, that SS troops taken prisoner in the following days should not necessarily expect to be treated according to the normal conventions of war, and there is substantial historical evidence that in the days after Malmedy, American soldiers in some units did indeed shoot German prisoners, particularly those wearing SS insignia, in direct retaliation. This is one of the uglier truths of the war that rarely made it into official histories for decades afterward, but it speaks directly to how completely the Malmedy massacre transformed American attitudes toward the Waffen-SS specifically. Where the Wehrmacht in North Africa and Italy had earned a grudging respect, the SS at Malmedy earned a hatred that many American veterans carried with them for the rest of their lives. Joachim Peiper himself would later be tried and convicted for his role in the massacre, sentenced to death, though the sentence was eventually commuted, and he would spend years afterward as a subject of ongoing investigation and public anger, eventually dying under mysterious and violent circumstances in France in 1976, when his home was firebombed, likely by individuals seeking a form of vigilante justice more than 3 decades after the war's end. Not every German unit encountered during the Bulge fought with the brutality of Kampfgruppe Peiper, however, and American soldiers were generally careful, even in their private letters and diaries, to distinguish between different types of German formations. The Fallschirmjäger, Germany's elite paratroopers, had already earned a formidable reputation among American forces well before the Ardennes offensive, dating back to the fighting in Sicily and at Monte Cassino, where German paratroopers had defended positions with a discipline and tenacity that impressed even their enemies. At Carentan in June of 1944, American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division fought a brutal battle against German Fallschirmjäger for control of the town, and veterans of that fight often described their German counterparts with a striking degree of professional respect, viewing them almost as a mirror image of their own elite status within their respective armies. There was, American paratroopers frequently noted, something different about facing other paratroopers, a shared sense of belonging to an elite brotherhood that transcended, without erasing, the fact that they were trying to kill each other. This sentiment echoed the kind of grudging respect that had characterized encounters with the Afrika Korps in the desert, a recognition among professional soldiers that skill and courage, however deployed, deserved a certain acknowledgement even from the men on the receiving end of it. American veterans of the fighting at Carentan, and later in the Ardennes, where Fallschirmjäger units under General Heinz Kokott also distinguished themselves in the defence of Bastogne, often ranked the German paratroopers among the most formidable infantry they encountered in the entire war, formidable in a way that was frightening on the battlefield but somehow easier to respect afterward than the fanaticism of the SS. Beyond the fear of tanks, machine guns, and elite formations, individual American infantrymen developed a particular and very personal dread of one type of German soldier above nearly all others: the sniper. German snipers, often equipped with the excellent Karabiner 98K rifle fitted with telescopic sights, were responsible for a disproportionate share of American casualties in close terrain, particularly in the hedgerows of Normandy and later in the forests along the German border. American soldiers developed an almost superstitious wariness around any position that might conceal a sniper, learning through hard experience to avoid silhouetting themselves against the skyline, to move quickly across open ground, and to treat any unexplained single shot with the gravest suspicion. Stories circulated widely, some true and some almost certainly exaggerated by the fog of rumour that accompanies every war, about German snipers who had killed dozens of American soldiers before finally being located and killed themselves, about snipers who deliberately targeted officers and medics in violation of the laws of war, and about the particular brutality with which American soldiers sometimes treated captured snipers, who in some documented cases were shown considerably less mercy than other German prisoners. The psychology here was straightforward enough. A sniper killed from concealment, denying his victims any chance to fight back. And this asymmetry bred a resentment among American infantrymen that went beyond ordinary combat hatred into something more personal and more visceral. Whatever grudging respect existed for German tank crews or paratroopers rarely extended to snipers, who occupied a unique and uniquely feared position in the American soldier's mental catalogue of the enemy. Underlying nearly all of these varied impressions, from the technical respect for German armour to the visceral fear of the MG42 to the deep and abiding hatred reserved for the Waffen-SS after Malmedy, was a broader distinction that American soldiers drew, sometimes explicitly and sometimes only half-consciously, between the ordinary Wehrmacht soldier and the ideology he served. Many American GIs, particularly those who had grown up in communities with German immigrant heritage of their own, which was extremely common throughout the American Midwest, found it difficult to sustain a simple, cartoonish hatred of the German as an abstract category. Letters home and post-war interviews reveal soldiers who described their German prisoners as tired, frightened young men who looked remarkably similar to American soldiers, who carried photographs of their own families, who complained about the same lousy food and the same endless marching that American soldiers complained about. This recognition of a shared humanity coexisted, often uncomfortably, with full awareness of the atrocities being committed by the regime those same soldiers served, and this tension would only deepen as American forces pushed into Germany itself in the final months of the war, and began to encounter direct evidence of the Nazi system's true horror. Nowhere was the grinding, exhausting nature of the fight against the German army more apparent than in the Hürtgen forest, a dense and forbidding stretch of woodland along the German border that became the site of one of the costliest and least celebrated battles fought by American forces in the entire European campaign. Beginning in September of 1944 and continuing into the following winter, American divisions were fed piecemeal into the forest against determined German defenders who had spent months preparing bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire among the dense fir trees. The terrain itself worked against the Americans in ways that made their normal advantages in artillery and air support far less effective, since the thick forest canopy caused artillery shells to detonate in the treetops, showering deadly wood splinters and shrapnel down onto exposed soldiers below, a phenomenon soldiers came to call tree bursts, and one that produced ghastly casualties on both sides. American infantrymen who survived the Hürtgen forest often described the German defenders they faced there in terms that combined exhaustion, respect, and something close to bewilderment at how such a badly outnumbered and outgunned force could continue resisting for so long. Veterans of the 4th, 9th and 28th Infantry Divisions, all of which suffered catastrophic losses in the forest, remembered German soldiers who fought from well-camouflaged positions with a stubbornness that seemed to defy the increasingly obvious fact that Germany was losing the war. By this point in the conflict, many of the German units defending the Hürtgen were a patchwork of veteran cadres stiffened with older reservists, and even teenagers pressed into service as Germany's manpower reserves dwindled. Yet American soldiers frequently noted that even these makeshift units fought with a discipline and a willingness to die in place that seemed almost incomprehensible, given how clearly the war's outcome had already been decided by late 1944. This was one of the recurring puzzles that American soldiers wrestled with throughout the final year of the war. Why did German soldiers keep fighting? And fighting well, long after any rational calculation would have suggested that surrender was the wiser course. The answers American soldiers arrived at varied enormously, from simple fear of what awaited deserters under Nazi military justice, to genuine ideological conviction among a hard core of true believers, to something more mundane and more universal, the simple soldier's instinct to stick with the men in his own unit, regardless of the larger strategic picture. An instinct American soldiers recognized in themselves as much as in their enemies. By late 1944, American generals commanding the war in Europe had developed their own detailed and often surprisingly nuanced assessments of the German army as a fighting force, assessments that filtered down through official intelligence summaries into the collective wisdom passed among ordinary soldiers. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the 12th Army Group during the campaign in northwest Europe, was known to hold a deep professional respect for German operational skill, even while remaining utterly clear-eyed about the criminal nature of the regime those soldiers served. Bradley's own memoirs, published after the war, described German defensive tactics with an almost academic admiration for their efficiency, praising the speed with which German commanders could organize a coherent defense out of retreating and disorganized units, a skill American commanders recognized as genuinely formidable, even as they worked to overcome it. General George Patton, never a man to mince words, held a complicated and at times contradictory set of views about the German army, expressing at various points both fierce contempt for Nazi ideology and a kind of soldier's admiration for German tactical aggression, a style of warfare that mirrored his own preference for speed, movement, and relentless offensive pressure. Patton reportedly told subordinates that the Germans, whatever their crimes, remained the best soldiers in the world from a purely technical standpoint. A comment that reflected the widespread professional respect many senior American officers held for German operational doctrine, even as they recognized and increasingly documented the horrors that doctrine had been placed in service of. Eisenhower himself, as Supreme Allied Commander, took a broader view that balanced the tactical respect his subordinate commanders often expressed with an unwavering focus on the moral dimensions of the war being fought. Eisenhower was known to be deeply concerned that ordinary American soldiers might lose sight of why the war was being fought at all if they focused too narrowly on the technical proficiency of the enemy, and he would later insist upon the discovery of the concentration camp system in the spring of 1945, that American units tour the camps and that German civilians in nearby towns be forced to confront what had been done in their name, precisely because he understood how easily professional respect for an enemy's fighting skill could obscure the deeper truth of what that enemy's government had actually done. This tension between respecting the German soldier as a fighting man and never forgetting the criminal cause he served would only intensify as the war entered its final and most revealing phase. The grinding stalemate at Anzio, where American and British forces found themselves pinned down on a narrow beachhead for nearly 4 months in early 1944 under constant German artillery bombardment, produced its own specific catalogue of American impressions regarding German fighting capability, chief among them a deep and lasting respect for the sheer volume and accuracy of German artillery fire. Soldiers trapped on the Anzio beachhead endured near-constant shelling from German guns positioned in the surrounding hills, including massive railway guns nicknamed Anzio Annie by the American troops who lived in fear of their arrival, weapons so large they had to be moved along rail lines and that fired shells capable of devastating entire city blocks. American soldiers who survived the Anzio beachhead often rated German artillery as the single most feared element of the entire German arsenal, more dreaded even than tanks or machine guns, because artillery offered no opportunity for direct confrontation or tactical response, only the grim experience of enduring bombardment while dug into whatever shelter could be found in the flat, exposed terrain surrounding the beachhead. The German commander overseeing the counterattacks against the Anzio beachhead, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, earned a reputation among American planners as one of the most capable defensive commanders in the entire German army, a reputation reinforced by his skillful conduct of the fighting retreat up the Italian peninsula that followed the eventual breakout from Anzio in the summer of 1944. American war planners and intelligence analysts working out of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force spent considerable effort throughout the campaign attempting to systematize exactly the kind of grudging, unit-by-unit respect that individual soldiers developed through direct combat experience, producing detailed order of battle assessments that ranked German divisions by combat effectiveness, morale, and equipment quality. These official intelligence assessments, drawing on prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and battlefield performance, generally confirmed what soldiers on the ground already sensed intuitively. That German combat effectiveness varied enormously by formation, with veteran panzer and parachute divisions consistently rated far more dangerous than static coastal defense units or hastily assembled Volksgrenadier formations cobbled together from a mixture of experienced cadre and inexperienced replacements. This formal intelligence apparatus, staffed by officers who studied the German army with the same rigor a chess player might study an opponent's characteristic openings, fed directly into how American commanders planned offensives, often specifically routing attacks around known strongpoints held by elite German formations in favor of sectors held by weaker units, a practical application of the same nuanced understanding of German military quality that individual soldiers were developing through direct, often terrifying personal experience in the field. As American forces crossed the Siegfried Line and pushed into Germany itself in the final weeks of 1944 and the opening months of 1945, the composition of the German army defending its own homeland changed dramatically, and American soldiers found themselves confronting an enemy that looked less and less like the confident, professional Wehrmacht they had faced in Normandy. Adolf Hitler's regime, desperate for manpower after catastrophic losses on both the eastern and western fronts, had begun conscripting the Volkssturm, a militia force composed of old men, teenage boys, and anyone else still capable of holding a rifle who had not already been sent to the front. American soldiers who encountered Volkssturm units in the closing months of the war often described the experience with a strange and uncomfortable mixture of emotions that differed sharply from anything they had felt fighting the Waffen-SS at Malmedy, or the professional panzer crews of Panzerlehr. Where the SS had inspired hatred and the Wehrmacht regulars had inspired respect, the Volkssturm inspired something closer to pity, tinged with a persistent unease about the fanaticism that Nazi propaganda had managed to instill even in children. Reports from American units advancing into Germany describe encounters with boys as young as 12 or 13, armed with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, ambushing American tanks and armoured vehicles with a courage that officers on both sides recognized as tragic rather than admirable. One American tank commander, recalling an encounter with a group of Hitler youth boys who had knocked out a Sherman tank with Panzerfausts near the end of the war, described the mixture of fury and heartbreak that rippled through his unit when they discovered how young their attackers actually were. Some American soldiers, particularly those who were fathers themselves, found these encounters almost unbearable, a grim illustration of just how completely the Nazi regime had consumed its own society by the war's final months. Others, hardened by years of combat and the loss of friends, felt little sympathy, regardless of the age of the soldier who had just tried to kill them, a testament to how thoroughly the accumulated trauma of years of fighting had worn down whatever capacity for nuance individual soldiers might otherwise have retained. The treatment of German prisoners of war, more broadly, reveals another layer of complexity in how American soldiers actually regarded their enemy, a layer that official histories and Hollywood films have often smoothed over in favor of simpler narratives. For the vast majority of German prisoners, particularly ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers captured in large numbers during the final collapse of German resistance in the spring of 1945, American treatment was generally correct and often surprisingly generous by the standards of a brutal war. American logistics allowed for prisoner of war camps that, whatever their overcrowding and hardship, compared favorably to the conditions Soviet prisoners endured in German captivity, or that German and Soviet prisoners endured in each other's hands on the Eastern Front. Many German prisoners taken by American forces in the final weeks of the war actively sought out American captors rather than risk falling into Soviet hands, aware of the vastly different treatment likely to await them depending on which army captured them first. This preference itself reveals something important about the reputation American forces had earned among ordinary German soldiers, a reputation for a kind of rough decency, that stood in marked contrast to the ideological brutality that had characterized the war in the East. At the same time, this general pattern of correct treatment coexisted with darker episodes, including documented cases of American soldiers killing German prisoners in the heat of battle, particularly SS prisoners in the aftermath of atrocities like Malmedy, and including the notorious post-war controversy over the treatment of German prisoners held in vast open-air enclosures along the Rhine in the final weeks of the war, where inadequate shelter, food, and medical care led to significant suffering and, according to some contested historical accounts, thousands of preventable deaths. The reality of how American soldiers treated their German captives, in other words, was neither the uniformly humane story of official propaganda, nor the uniformly brutal story sometimes advanced by revisionist historians, but something messier and more human, shaped by the specific circumstances, the specific unit, and the specific atrocities that particular American soldiers had witnessed or heard about before the moment of capture arrived. Nothing, however, transformed the American soldier's understanding of the war he was fighting more completely than the discovery of the Nazi concentration camp system in the final weeks of the conflict. When American forces liberated camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Ohrdruf in April of 1945, soldiers who had spent years developing complicated, often grudgingly respectful views of the German soldier across the battlefield encountered something that obliterated any remaining ambiguity about the nature of the regime that soldier had served. General Dwight Eisenhower, upon touring Ohrdruf shortly after its liberation, was reportedly so shaken by what he witnessed that he insisted on documenting the camp in exhaustive detail, specifically because he anticipated that future generations might doubt such horrors had actually occurred. He ordered that as many American soldiers as possible be brought through the camps to bear witness, and that German civilians from nearby towns be forced to walk through the facilities, and in some cases, help bury the dead, a policy explicitly designed to ensure that no one, soldier or civilian, could later claim ignorance of what had happened in their midst. For American soldiers who toured these camps, the experience fundamentally reshaped their understanding of everything they had witnessed in the preceding months of combat: the grudging respect for German military professionalism, the recognition of shared humanity between exhausted young men on both sides of the line. All of it now had to be reconciled with direct, undeniable physical evidence of systematic mass murder on an almost incomprehensible scale. Soldiers who had felt sympathy for surrendering Wehrmacht troops now found themselves wondering how many of those same soldiers, or their fathers, brothers, and neighbours, had participated in or simply looked away from the machinery of the Holocaust. This was not a simple, sudden reversal of every previous impression American soldiers had formed. Many veterans later described the discovery of the camps not as a contradiction of what they already believed about the war, but as a horrifying confirmation and deepening of suspicions that had been building for months, ever since rumours of mass atrocities on the Eastern Front and reports from resistance movements in occupied countries had begun filtering through to Allied intelligence circles. The distinction American soldiers had carefully maintained throughout the war between the professional Wehrmacht soldier and the fanatical SS true believer came under particular strain in the aftermath of the camp liberations, because it quickly became clear that the SS ran the concentration camp system directly, while the broader German military and German society more generally had, at minimum, allowed the system to function for years without meaningful resistance. Some American soldiers responded to this realization by hardening their view of the entire German nation, concluding that the earlier distinctions they had drawn between decent Wehrmacht soldiers and criminal SS fanatics had been naive, a comforting fiction that obscured a much broader complicity running through German society as a whole. Other American soldiers maintained their earlier distinctions even after witnessing the camps, continuing to draw a line between the ordinary conscripted infantryman fighting a war he had not chosen and the ideologically committed apparatus of the SS and the Nazi Party specifically responsible. For the death camps, this debate in miniature mirrored a much larger historical and philosophical argument about collective guilt and individual responsibility that scholars and historians would continue wrestling with for decades after the war ended. And it's worth noting that American soldiers themselves, writing in letters home and in post-war memoirs, rarely arrived at a single tidy conclusion. The war had shown them too much complexity, too many contradictions for any simple verdict to feel entirely honest. war correspondents traveling with American forces provide another crucial window into how ordinary soldiers actually experienced and articulated their views of the enemy, since these journalists spent their days embedded directly among combat troops and often captured impressions that never made it into official reports or post-war official histories. Ernie Pyle, perhaps the most beloved war correspondent of the entire conflict, wrote with extraordinary empathy about the experience of the ordinary American infantryman. And in doing so, he frequently touched on how those soldiers viewed their German counterparts. Pyle's columns, syndicated in hundreds of American newspapers and read by millions of families anxiously following the war, often depicted the German soldier not as a cartoonish monster, but as a competent, sometimes even sympathetic figure whose suffering, while never equated with the moral rightness of the American cause, was nonetheless rendered with a reporter's careful eye for human detail. Pyle described German prisoners with the same careful, humanizing attention he brought to American soldiers, noting their exhaustion, their youth, their evident relief at having survived to be captured rather than killed. This approach occasionally drew criticism from readers who felt Pyle was being too generous toward an enemy responsible for such enormous suffering, but it also reflected an authentic truth about how many American soldiers themselves actually experienced their encounters with individual German prisoners, a truth that existed alongside, rather than in contradiction to, their broader understanding of the war's moral stakes. Andy Rooney, another correspondent who would later become famous for his television commentary, covered the war for Stars and Stripes and similarly captured the complicated, often contradictory attitudes American soldiers held toward their German adversaries. Attitudes that shifted depending on which unit they were fighting, what atrocities they had recently witnessed or heard about, and how exhausted and embittered years of combat had left them by any particular point in the war. High above the battlefields of Europe, an entirely different kind of relationship developed between American and German combatants, one shaped by the peculiar culture of aerial warfare that had persisted, in modified form, from the First World War. American bomber crews flying missions over Germany faced Luftwaffe fighter pilots who were, by most accounts, among the most skilled aviators in the world. Men who had often accumulated staggering numbers of aerial victories, flying continuously from the early days of the war until Germany's defeat. American airmen developed a grudging and at times remarkably warm respect for their Luftwaffe counterparts that differed noticeably from the attitudes ground troops held toward the infantry and armor they faced. Pilots on both sides frequently spoke of a shared fraternity of flight that transcended national loyalty, a sense that the extraordinary skill and courage required simply to survive as a fighter pilot or bomber crewman created bonds of mutual recognition that ground combat rarely produced. There are numerous documented instances of German fighter pilots declining to finish off crippled American bombers once it became clear the crew had no chance to fight back. Most famously, the encounter between German ace Franz Stigler and American B-17 pilot Charlie Brown in December of 1943, when Stigler escorted Brown's shattered bomber to the edge of German airspace rather than shooting it down, a story that remained secret for decades until the two men, astonishingly, reconnected and became close friends late in life. While such acts of aerial chivalry were far from universal, and plenty of American airmen were killed by German fighters showing no such mercy, the culture of the air war did produce a distinct set of attitudes among American air crews toward the Luftwaffe, attitudes that emphasized skill, courage, and a certain professional code of conduct, even amid the brutal reality that both sides were trying to kill each other in the skies over a burning continent. American fighter pilots who tangled with German aces flying the Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the formidable Focke-Wulf 19 often described these encounters in almost sporting terms after the fact, a strange vocabulary for describing combat that resulted in death for one party or the other, but one that captured something real about how airmen on both sides understood their shared, isolated experience, thousands of feet above the ground, war being fought below them. Back on the ground, the German army's logistical and engineering capabilities earned a specific and often underappreciated respect from American soldiers who witnessed firsthand just how effectively German units could improvise under conditions of chronic shortage. By 1944 and 1945, German forces were operating with severely limited fuel, spare parts and replacement equipment. Yet, American soldiers repeatedly encountered German engineering units capable of constructing sophisticated field fortifications, laying complex minefields and executing rapid demolitions of bridges and roads with an efficiency that consistently slowed the American advance. The demolition of bridges across French and German rivers became such a persistent obstacle that American engineers developed an almost professional rivalry with their German counterparts, racing to seize crossings before German engineers could complete their charges. This rivalry reached its most dramatic conclusion at the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March of 1945, when American forces of the 9th Armored Division captured the bridge across the Rhine intact after German demolition charges failed to fully detonate, a stroke of good fortune that allowed American forces to establish a bridgehead across the Rhine weeks ahead of schedule. The German engineers responsible for the failed demolition were later court-martialed, and several were executed on Hitler's direct order, a grim illustration of just how high the stakes had become for German soldiers who failed to perform their duties by this stage of the war, when the regime's response to failure had become increasingly brutal, even toward its own men. American soldiers who studied the Remagen crossing afterward, and indeed who fought through the chaotic final months of the war more broadly, developed a sense that the German army by 1945 was fighting not merely against the Allies, but increasingly against the crushing, often irrational demands of a regime turning on its own soldiers with the same ruthlessness it had shown toward its declared enemies throughout the war. The Falaise Pocket, where retreating German forces were nearly encircled and destroyed by advancing American, British, Canadian and Polish forces in August of 1944, produced some of the most visceral and disturbing impressions American soldiers formed of the German army's final desperate fighting capacity. As German units attempted to escape the closing trap, American and Allied artillery and air power inflicted catastrophic casualties on columns of retreating vehicles, horses and soldiers, creating scenes of destruction so total that American soldiers who later moved through the pocket described the experience in almost apocalyptic terms: roads choked with the wreckage of vehicles and the bodies of men and animals for miles on end. Yet even amid this slaughter, German units that remained organized fought with a discipline that impressed American observers, conducting fighting withdrawals and rearguard actions that allowed a substantial portion of the trapped German forces to escape the pocket, despite overwhelming Allied firepower. This combination of catastrophic destruction and stubborn, skilled resistance amid the ruins of a shattered army captured something essential about how American soldiers experienced the German military in the war's final year, an enemy simultaneously being annihilated and yet somehow continuing to function as a coherent fighting force almost until the final surrender. It's worth pausing here to consider how the experience of Black American soldiers, serving largely in segregated units throughout the European campaign, shaped a distinct set of perspectives on the German enemy that differed in important ways from the experiences of their white counterparts. Nazi propaganda had long emphasized virulent racial ideology, and German forces sometimes specifically targeted propaganda at Black American soldiers, questioning why they would fight for a country that treated them as second-class citizens at home. Yet many black veterans later reported a startling and uncomfortable realization. German civilians and even German prisoners of war frequently treated them with less overt racial hostility than they experienced from some of their own fellow American soldiers or from the Jim Crow laws waiting for them back home. This is not to suggest that Nazi Germany's racial ideology was anything other than monstrous, nor that individual German soldiers were free of racial prejudice, but the specific lived experience of Black American soldiers moving through European towns and interacting with German civilians and prisoners often produced a bitter irony that veterans carried home with them. A recognition that the very army fighting to defend an ideology of racial supremacy had, in the day-to-day texture of individual encounters, sometimes treated them with more basic human dignity than they received from their own countrymen. Units like the 761st Tank Battalion, the first black armoured unit to see combat for the United States, distinguished themselves in the fighting across France and Germany. And the soldiers of this unit developed their own complex and specific relationship to the question of what the German soldier represented, an enemy whose regime's ideology they were risking their lives to defeat, even as that same fight forced them to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of the democracy they served back home. Another important dimension of how American soldiers viewed the German military involved their direct exposure, often for the first time, to rumours and later confirmed reports of the war being fought on the Eastern Front, a conflict of a scale and savagery that dwarfed anything American troops experienced in North Africa, Italy, or Western Europe. American soldiers occasionally encountered German veterans who had been transferred from the Eastern Front after being wounded, or who had survived years of fighting against the Soviet Union before being sent west, and the stories these men told, when they were willing to talk at all, painted a picture of a conflict defined by an entirely different level of brutality and desperation. German prisoners captured in the West sometimes expressed something close to relief at having been taken by American rather than Soviet forces, aware that the war in the East had been conducted according to a logic of mutual extermination that made the fighting against the Western Allies seem, by grim comparison, almost restrained. This awareness filtered into how American soldiers understood their own place within the broader war, a growing recognition that they were fighting one theatre of a conflict whose true depths of horror were unfolding thousands of miles away, on a front most American soldiers would never see firsthand, but whose shadow nonetheless coloured every encounter with German prisoners who had served there. Some American intelligence officers debriefing these prisoners came away with a grudging respect for the sheer endurance German soldiers on the Eastern Front had displayed, surviving Russian winters, catastrophic casualties, and a Soviet enemy whose numbers seemed inexhaustible, even as they recoiled from the accounts of atrocities against Soviet civilians and prisoners that inevitably accompanied these same soldiers' stories. The question of German civilian attitudes and how American soldiers navigated their occupation of German towns and cities in the final weeks of the war and afterward adds yet another layer to understanding how the American view of the German evolved over the course of the conflict. As American forces pushed into Germany proper in early 1945, soldiers who had spent years fighting an enemy army now found themselves face to face with German civilians, including women, children, and elderly people who had lived under Nazi rule for over a decade, and who now confronted the reality of occupation by a foreign army. American military policy officially discouraged fraternization with German civilians in the early months of the occupation, reflecting official concern about the loyalty of a population that had, after all, supported Hitler's regime for years. In practice, this policy proved almost impossible to enforce, and American soldiers, many of them barely out of their teens themselves, formed all manner of relationships and impressions of the German civilian population that varied enormously depending on individual circumstances. Some soldiers carried their hatred of the Nazi regime directly onto the German civilians they encountered, holding an entire population responsible for the crimes committed in their name. Others found themselves surprised by the ordinary humanity of the German families whose homes they now occupied, families who seemed, in the words of more than one American veteran, remarkably similar to the families waiting back home in Ohio or Kansas, a similarity that complicated rather than resolved the moral questions raised by the war's final phase. This tension between collective judgment and individual human recognition, which had already characterized American attitudes toward German soldiers throughout the fighting, extended naturally into the occupation period and would continue to shape American attitudes toward Germany for years, even decades, after the war's formal end. The declining quality and morale of German forces in the war's final months produced its own distinct set of impressions among American soldiers, impressions that shifted noticeably from the respect and fear that had characterized encounters with German forces in 1943 and 1944. By the spring of 1945, American units advancing rapidly through central Germany increasingly encountered German soldiers eager to surrender, entire units abandoning positions rather than fighting to the last man, and a general collapse of the discipline and cohesion that had so impressed American observers earlier in the war. Some American veterans described almost anticlimactic final weeks of combat, marching through German towns that offered token resistance or none at all, taking hundreds of prisoners in a single day where earlier campaigns had required weeks of brutal fighting to advance a few miles. This rapid collapse produced a strange psychological effect among American soldiers who had spent years bracing themselves for an enemy of formidable skill and determination, only to watch that enemy dissolve with startling speed once the war's outcome became undeniable, even to the most committed German soldiers. Yet this general pattern of collapse was far from universal, and pockets of fanatical resistance, particularly from SS units and some of the more ideologically committed Wehrmacht formations, continued fighting with startling ferocity right up to the moment of Germany's unconditional surrender in May of 1945, producing a jarring and confusing final chapter to the war in which American soldiers might encounter mass surrenders in one town and suicidal last stands in the next, sometimes on the very same day. Individual letters and diaries preserved from American soldiers who fought across this entire arc of the war, from North Africa through the final collapse of Germany, offer perhaps the richest and most unfiltered window into how ordinary GIs actually processed their evolving views of the enemy in real time, unmediated by the narrative smoothing that inevitably shapes memoirs written decades after the fact. These contemporary documents reveal soldiers who were often far more ambivalent, far more willing to hold contradictory views simultaneously than the cleaner narratives constructed in post-war histories and popular films. A soldier might write home in one letter expressing genuine sympathy for a group of exhausted German prisoners, and in another letter, written only weeks later after losing a close friend in combat, express a hatred so total it left no room for nuance of any kind. This oscillation was not hypocrisy so much as an honest reflection of how combat actually shapes human psychology, a process in which sustained exposure to violence, loss, and fear produces attitudes that shift and contradict themselves in ways that any single, tidy characterization of how American soldiers viewed the Germans inevitably fails to capture. Historians and oral history projects that have collected thousands of these accounts in the decades since the war, including extensive archives maintained by institutions dedicated to preserving veteran testimony, have consistently found that the most honest answer to the question of what American soldiers thought of their German adversaries is not a single answer at all, but a spectrum of overlapping and sometimes contradictory attitudes that varied by unit, by campaign, by which specific German formation a soldier happened to face, and by the specific atrocities or acts of decency the particular soldier happened to witness with his own eyes. Naval encounters, while less central to the ground soldiers' daily experience of the war, nonetheless shaped American attitudes toward the broader German military in ways worth noting here. American sailors who captured German U-boat crews, particularly in the war's earlier years, often described these prisoners with a specific professional respect distinct from anything expressed by infantrymen fighting on land, a respect rooted in recognition of the extraordinarily high casualty rates German submarine crews suffered throughout the war, rates that exceeded those of almost any other branch of the German military, and that meant surviving U-boat sailors captured by American forces had typically already endured months or years of extraordinarily dangerous service beneath the waves of the Atlantic. American naval officers who interrogated captured U-boat commanders frequently came away impressed by their technical sophistication and their evident pride in a branch of service that, whatever its ultimate strategic failure against increasingly effective American and British anti-submarine tactics, had genuinely threatened to sever the vital supply lines connecting America to the European theatre in the war's earlier years. This grudging respect for the technical proficiency of the U-boat service mirrored in miniature the broader pattern this account has traced throughout the ground war, professional admiration for skill and courage coexisting with unwavering awareness of the larger cause that skill had been placed in service of. A pattern that held true, it seems, across every branch and every theatre of the German military that American forces encountered throughout the war. The specific dynamics of urban combat, which American soldiers encountered with increasing frequency as the campaign moved from the rural hedgerows of Normandy toward the cities and towns of Germany itself, produced its own distinct catalogue of impressions regarding German fighting capability. City fighting favoured defenders in ways that rural and forest combat did not always allow, and German soldiers defending towns like Aachen and later cities across the Rhineland and into central Germany proved adept at using the rubble of shattered buildings, basement tunnels connecting entire city blocks, and prepared strongpoints in church towers and factory buildings to inflict maximum casualties on advancing American infantry. American soldiers who fought through these urban battles developed a specific wariness toward German defenders that differed from the wariness they had developed in open or forested terrain, a hyper-awareness of windows, doorways, and roof lines that could conceal a machine gun position or a single determined defender armed with a Panzerfaust capable of destroying an American tank at close range in the narrow confines of a city street. This style of fighting, grinding and merciless, block by block and sometimes room by room, produced some of the most intimate and terrifying encounters between American and German soldiers of the entire war. Encounters at ranges of only a few feet that left little room for the kind of professional detachment that characterized combat at greater distances, and American soldiers who survived extended urban combat against determined German defenders often carried particularly vivid and particularly haunting memories of these close-range encounters for the remainder of their lives. One of the more surprising threads running through American soldiers' evolving assessment of the German army involves specific individual German commanders whose reputations became well known, even celebrated, among the American officers and intelligence staffs tracking them throughout the campaign. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aging and aristocratic commander who oversaw German forces in the West for much of the war, earned a reputation among American intelligence officers as a competent, old-school professional soldier whose relationship with Hitler was famously strained, a man who reportedly referred to Hitler in private as that bohemian corporal, a remark that circulated among American intelligence circles and reinforced a growing American understanding that the German officer corps was far from monolithic in its devotion to Nazi ideology. Von Rundstedt's eventual dismissal and reinstatement, his skepticism towards some of Hitler's more reckless strategic decisions, and his obvious professional distaste for the political interference that increasingly characterized German military decision-making by 1944, all fed into an American perception that a meaningful, if ultimately powerless, current of old-fashioned Prussian military professionalism persisted within the German high command, even as the Nazi Party's grip over military affairs tightened. General Alfred Jodl, whose earlier comments comparing Patton to a German-style commander had circulated among Allied intelligence, represented another figure whose professional assessments of Allied leadership, gathered through captured documents and later through direct post-war interrogation, revealed a German high command that had studied its opponents with considerable care and, in many cases, arrived at judgments about Allied generals that mirrored the grudging respect flowing in the opposite direction. This mutual professional assessment between opposing high commands, each studying the other with a mixture of respect, contempt, and cold calculation, added yet another dimension to how the war was actually experienced and understood by the men fighting it. A dimension largely invisible to soldiers in the foxholes, but very much present in the strategic thinking that shaped the battles those soldiers fought. The performance of German mountain troops, the Gebirgsjäger, in the fighting through Italy and later in the Alps, left a particularly strong impression on American soldiers who encountered them, an impression built on genuine respect for skills that seemed almost superhuman to infantrymen, more accustomed to fighting across open or forested terrain. German mountain troops moved with a speed and confidence through terrain that American soldiers found exhausting simply to traverse, let alone fight through, and their training in mountaineering, skiing and cold weather survival gave them a decisive edge in the high passes and ridgelines of the Italian campaign. American soldiers who fought against Gebirgsjäger units often described these encounters with a specific kind of professional awe, recognizing that they were facing troops whose specialized training represented years of investment by the German military in a niche but highly effective form of combat. This respect for specialized German training extended to other elite formations as well, including German combat engineers whose skill at rapid bridge construction, minefield clearance and fortification work repeatedly impressed American units who found themselves racing against German engineering timetables throughout the campaign. It became something of a running theme in American after-action reports and intelligence summaries. Whatever moral judgment history would ultimately render on the German army's cause, the technical and tactical proficiency of its specialized units, from mountain troops to combat engineers to armored crews, represented a genuinely formidable standard that American forces had to study, respect, and ultimately overcome through superior numbers, material abundance, and, increasingly as the war progressed, hard-won tactical experience of their own. American medical personnel who treated wounded German prisoners throughout the war offer another distinct vantage point on how the war was experienced across enemy lines, one shaped less by combat and more by the intimate human work of tending to wounded and dying men, regardless of the uniform they wore. American medics and surgeons operating field hospitals routinely treated German wounded alongside American casualties, a practice mandated by the Geneva Conventions, but one that also reflected a genuine professional ethic among American medical personnel that transcended, at least in the operating theatre, the broader hatreds of the war. Numerous accounts survive of American doctors and nurses who developed complicated relationships with German patients under their care, relationships that sometimes lasted only the duration of a single surgery and sometimes extended into ongoing correspondence that continued for years after the war ended. These medical encounters produce some of the most direct testimony available regarding the ordinary humanity of individual German soldiers, stripped of their weapons and uniforms, and reduced to the vulnerable, frightened state that combat wounds produce in any human being, regardless of which flag he had been fighting under. At the same time, American medical personnel were not immune to the broader currents of anger and hatred that flowed through the army as a whole, and there are documented instances of German wounded receiving markedly inferior care compared to American casualties, particularly in the chaotic final weeks of the war, when resources were stretched thin and patience for extending compassion to the enemy had worn correspondingly thinner among exhausted medical staff who had spent years treating the human wreckage that German weapons had inflicted on their own countrymen. The specific experience of American soldiers who served as interrogators, tasked with extracting tactical and strategic intelligence from captured German prisoners, provides yet another revealing window into the complicated professional relationship that developed between opposing forces, even in the most adversarial of circumstances. American interrogators, many of them German-speaking immigrants or the children of German immigrants themselves, a group that included a disproportionate number of German Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi persecution before the war and who now found themselves interrogating the soldiers of the regime that had driven them from their homes, developed sophisticated techniques for extracting information that relied less on coercion and more on psychological insight into German military culture and individual soldiers' fears, loyalties, and grievances. These interrogators often reported that German prisoners, once separated from their units and stripped of the peer pressure that had sustained their combat performance, proved remarkably willing to talk, particularly as the war progressed and confidence in ultimate German victory collapsed. The interrogation reports these men compiled reveal a German army whose internal cohesion, whatever its outward appearance of discipline and unity, concealed considerable variation in ideological commitment, morale, and willingness to continue fighting a war that, by 1944 and 1945, an increasing number of ordinary German soldiers privately recognized as lost. This intelligence, filtering back up through American command structures, shaped how American generals planned their campaigns and reinforced a broader American understanding that the German army, for all its tactical proficiency, was fighting on borrowed time, sustained by discipline, fear of the consequences of desertion under the Nazi military justice system, and a hard core of ideological true believers rather than by any remaining confidence in eventual victory. As American forces linked up with advancing Soviet troops along the Elbe River in late April of 1945, a moment that symbolically marked the final collapse of organized German resistance in the West, American soldiers found themselves reflecting on the entire arc of the campaign they had just fought, from the humiliation at Kasserine to the triumph of this final meeting with their Soviet allies in the heart of a defeated Germany. The German soldiers, who surrendered by the tens of thousands in these final weeks, presented American forces with an overwhelming logistical challenge. But they also presented a final, telling image of just how completely the once feared Wehrmacht had been reduced. Columns of German prisoners, many of them desperate to reach American lines before the advancing Soviet army could capture them, stretched for miles along roads throughout central Germany, a stark visual confirmation of everything American soldiers had come to understand about the collapse of German military power in the war's final phase. Yet even in this moment of total German defeat, American soldiers processing these mass surrenders continue to draw the same distinctions they had drawn throughout the war, treating ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers with a rough but generally correct decency, while remaining considerably more wary and considerably less generous towards soldiers still wearing SS insignia, whose reputation for fanaticism and atrocity had only deepened with each passing month of the war. Few aspects of this story are as strange or as little known as the experience of German prisoners of war who were shipped across the Atlantic and held in camps scattered throughout the American heartland, from Texas to Wisconsin to upstate New York, where They lived and worked for months or even years alongside American civilians in conditions that bore almost no resemblance to the fighting most of these prisoners had left behind in Europe. By 1945, more than 400,000 German prisoners were held in camps across the United States, and the interactions between these prisoners and the American civilians and soldiers who guarded and worked alongside them produced some of the most surprising and revealing testimony available about how ordinary Americans, not just combat soldiers, actually came to view the German enemy once the abstraction of the enemy was replaced by direct daily contact with individual German men. American farmers who employed German POW labor, permitted under agreements that allowed prisoners to work in agriculture and other essential industries facing wartime labor shortages, often developed working relationships with their German laborers that shaded into genuine friendship, sharing meals, exchanging small kindnesses, and in some documented cases, maintaining correspondence for years after the prisoners were repatriated back to Germany following the war's end. This experience, so far removed from the horror of the battlefield, offers a crucial counterpoint to the combat-focused impressions that dominate most accounts of American attitudes toward German soldiers, revealing an America in which ordinary citizens, guards, and even some soldiers assigned to POW camp duty came to see their German charges as individual human beings whose personal decency or unpleasantness varied just as widely as it would among any group of several 100,000 young men from any nation. It's worth noting that not every American who encountered German POW labor felt this warmth. Some communities, particularly those who had lost sons or brothers in the fighting overseas, viewed the presence of well-fed, healthy German prisoners working American farms with considerable bitterness, a resentment sharpened by the awareness that these prisoners were, by any reasonable comparison, living in far better conditions than American and Allied soldiers held in German or Japanese captivity at the very same moment. The post-war decades produced their own remarkable chapter in this story, as veterans on both sides, having survived the war and returned to civilian life, occasionally sought out and reconnected with former enemies in acts of reconciliation that would have seemed almost unimaginable amid the fighting itself. The story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler, the American bomber pilot, and the German fighter ace whose December 1943 encounter over Germany had ended not in Brown's death, but in Stiegler's quiet decision to let the crippled bomber escape, exemplifies this pattern in its most dramatic form. The two men did not meet again until 1990, when Brown, having spent years searching for the German pilot who had spared his life, finally located Stiegler living in Canada, and the two men formed a close friendship that lasted until their deaths within months of each other in 2008. A friendship built on a foundation of mutual respect that had, in fact, existed even in the split second of their wartime encounter, however much both men's roles that day had required them to view each other, officially, as mortal enemies. Similar though less dramatic reconciliations occurred throughout the post-war decades as American and German veterans, participating in battlefield tours, historical societies, and academic conferences dedicated to studying the war, found themselves sitting across tables from men they had once tried to kill, comparing notes on specific battles and specific days with a professional interest that, once again, echoed the grudging respect that had existed even during the fighting itself. These reunions were never simple or uncomplicated. American veterans who participated in them often described a genuine tension between the human warmth of reconnecting with a fellow survivor of the same terrible events and the persistent, unresolved anger many still carried about the cause their former enemies had fought for and the friends and comrades that cause had cost them. The way this entire story has been remembered and represented in American popular culture in the decades since the war deserves its own consideration, because the popular image of the German soldier in American film, television, and literature has shifted considerably over time in ways that reflect broader changes in how American society processes the memory of the war. Early post-war films often portrayed German soldiers in relatively simple, villainous terms, reflecting the immediate emotional aftermath of a war whose full horrors, including the scale of the Holocaust, were still being processed and understood by the American public. Later works, including Stephen Ambrose's extensively researched oral histories and the television adaptations they inspired, worked to recover the more complicated, nuanced picture that veterans themselves had always privately held, a picture that acknowledged German military skill and, in specific cases, individual decency, while never losing sight of the criminal nature of the cause German soldiers had served. This evolution in popular memory mirrors, in many ways, the evolution of professional historical scholarship on the subject, as historians gained access to a wider range of primary sources, including the interrogation reports, personal letters, and diaries that had remained largely unexamined in archives for decades, and as the generation of veterans who had actually lived through these experiences began, in their final years, to speak more openly about the full complexity of what they had witnessed and felt. Complexity that the immediate post-war decades, dominated by simpler patriotic narratives, had not always made room for. Taken together, the accumulated testimony of American soldiers who fought against the German army between 1942 and 1945 resists easy summary. And perhaps that resistance to simple categorization is itself the most important lesson this history has to offer. The German soldier American GIs encountered was not one thing, but many things simultaneously. A skilled professional, worthy of tactical respect, a terrifying killer wielding weapons that inspired genuine dread, a fanatical ideologue capable of atrocities that permanently hardened American attitudes, a frightened young man clutching photographs of his family, a boy soldier whose youth provoked pity even amid violence, and, in the case of the SS specifically, an active participant in or direct perpetrator of crimes against humanity that placed him entirely outside the bounds of ordinary soldierly respect. American soldiers held all of these images simultaneously, often without fully reconciling them, because the reality of the war they fought never offered the tidy moral clarity that hindsight and simplified popular memory sometimes impose upon it. What emerges from the letters, diaries, oral histories, and memoirs left behind by the men who actually fought this war is a portrait far richer and far more honest than any single narrative could capture, a portrait of young men on both sides of a terrible conflict, trying to survive, trying to make sense of what they were being asked to do, and, in the process, forming judgments about their enemy that were as varied, as contradictory, and as fundamentally human as the war itself. The battle for Aachen in October of 1944 offers one of the clearest illustrations of how American soldiers' attitudes toward the German enemy shifted the moment fighting moved from French and Belgian soil onto German territory itself. Aachen, the first major German city to fall to American forces, was defended with a ferocity that surprised American planners who had expected German resistance to soften once the fighting reached the home front. Instead, the opposite occurred. German soldiers defending Aachen, many of them scraped together from various shattered units along with police battalions and even some elderly Volkssturm conscripts, fought a brutal house-by-house battle that cost both sides heavily and that convinced American commanders that the assumption of an imminent German collapse had been badly premature. American soldiers who fought through the rubble of Aachen came away with a renewed respect for the German soldier's willingness to defend his own homeland with a ferocity that exceeded even the determined resistance encountered in France, a pattern that would repeat itself again and again as American forces pushed deeper into Germany over the following months. This intensification of German resistance on home soil complicated the narrative many American soldiers had begun constructing about a German army in terminal decline, forcing a recognition that desperation and homeland defense could produce a fighting intensity that pure military calculation might not have predicted. Historians studying this period have long debated what has come to be called the clean Wehrmacht myth, the post-war narrative cultivated in part by German veterans and historians in the decades immediately following the war, that the regular German army fought a conventional, largely honourable war, while atrocities were confined almost exclusively to the SS and other specifically Nazi Party formations. American soldiers' wartime testimony, examined honestly, both supports and complicates this narrative in ways that reward careful attention. It is true that American soldiers fighting in Western Europe generally experienced the Wehrmacht as a disciplined professional force that, whatever its ultimate service to a criminal regime, rarely engaged in the kind of systematic atrocity against American and British prisoners that characterized SS conduct at Malmedy and elsewhere. But American soldiers who fought alongside or gathered intelligence about the war in the East, and post-war historians who gained access to German military records, would eventually reveal that regular Wehrmacht units, not just the SS, participated extensively in war crimes against Soviet civilians, prisoners of war, and partisans, undermining any clean separation between a supposedly honourable regular army and a uniquely criminal SS. the version of the clean Wehrmacht that many American soldiers carried home from the Western Front, then reflected a real and important difference in how the war was fought in the West compared to the East, but it also reflected the limited window through which American soldiers actually experienced the German military, a window that showed them only one theatre of a much larger and, in the East, dramatically more brutal war. American soldiers who had previously fought against Italian forces in North Africa and Sicily before Italy's surrender in September of 1943, removed Italian troops from the fighting entirely, frequently drew explicit comparisons between the German and Italian soldiers they had faced, comparisons that reveal as much about American assumptions and biases as they do about any objective difference in fighting quality. Italian units, often poorly equipped, poorly supplied, and fighting for a regime many ordinary Italian soldiers had little enthusiasm for, surrendered in far greater numbers and with far less resistance than German units typically offered, and American soldiers, not always fairly, developed a reputation for Italian forces as reluctant, unenthusiastic combatants, compared to the disciplined, often fanatical German war machine. This comparison, however unfair to the many Italian units that did fight with genuine skill and courage, particularly in North Africa, reinforced by contrast just how formidable American soldiers considered the German army to be, a formidable reputation that, as we have seen throughout this account, coexisted uneasily with the mounting evidence of the moral catastrophe that army had been mobilized to serve. American war correspondents and combat historians embedded with frontline units also documented a curious phenomenon that recurred throughout the campaign: the tendency of American soldiers to develop highly specific, almost tribal loyalties and antipathies toward particular German divisions based on direct combat experience, loyalties that had little to do with any broader assessment of the Wehrmacht as a whole. A soldier who had fought against the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte at some point during the Ardennes offensive might carry a lifelong specific hatred for that formation in particular, distinct from whatever general views he held about German soldiers as a category, while a soldier who had faced the same division might have entirely different memories shaped by the particular circumstances of his own encounter. This granular, unit-specific memory helps explain why oral histories collected from American veterans often contradict each other so significantly, even when describing roughly the same period of the war, since the German army was not a monolithic entity, but a vast collection of individual divisions, regiments, and even smaller units whose combat performance, discipline, and conduct toward prisoners varied enormously, depending on their specific training, their commanding officers, their ideological composition, and simple battlefield circumstance. Understanding American attitudes toward the German soldier, in other words, requires resisting the temptation to flatten this experience into a single coherent narrative, because the soldiers who actually lived through it experienced a war defined as much by these specific, granular encounters as by any general theory of what the German army represented as a whole. The role of the German military police, the Feldgendarmerie, and their brutal enforcement of discipline within German ranks also left a distinct impression on American intelligence officers who interrogated captured German soldiers throughout the war, an impression that added yet another layer of complexity to how Americans understood the psychology sustaining German resistance in the war's final, increasingly hopeless months. German soldiers who attempted to desert or who retreated without authorization faced summary execution at the hands of these military police units, sometimes hanged from roadside trees with placards around their necks warning other soldiers of the consequences of cowardice, a practice that American soldiers advancing through Germany in 1945 encountered directly and that shocked even veterans who had grown accustomed to the war's other horrors. This systematic terror, deployed by the German military against its own soldiers, helped American intelligence officers understand why German resistance continued so stubbornly even after the war's outcome had become obvious to any rational observer, a resistance sustained not merely by ideological conviction or unit cohesion, but by simple, brutal coercion. American soldiers who learned of these practices, whether through captured documents, prisoner interrogations, or direct observation of executed deserters hanging along roadsides, often expressed a complicated mixture of horror at the practice itself and a kind of retroactive sympathy for the ordinary German soldiers who had continued fighting and dying, not necessarily out of conviction, but out of a well-founded fear of what awaited them if they stopped. The defence of the monastery hill at Monte Cassino, held for months in early 1944 by German Fallschirmjäger against repeated assaults by American, British, New Zealand, Indian and Polish forces, deserves particular attention here for how thoroughly it cemented the reputation of German paratroopers as perhaps the single most respected adversary American and Allied soldiers faced in the entire Italian campaign. Despite the controversial Allied bombing that reduced the ancient monastery itself to rubble in February of 1944, based on the mistaken belief that German forces were using it as an observation post, German paratroopers continued to hold the surrounding high ground with a tenacity that cost the attacking Allied forces tens of thousands of casualties before the position finally fell to Polish forces in May of 1944. American soldiers who fought in the periphery of this battle, even those not directly engaged in the direct assaults on the monastery hill itself, absorbed the growing legend of the German paratroopers' defense through the accounts that circulated widely within Allied ranks, accounts that reinforced the broader pattern of respect for German elite formations that this account has traced across multiple campaigns and multiple years of fighting. General Mark Clark, commanding the American Fifth Army in Italy, would later reflect that the German defense of Cassino represented one of the most skillfully conducted defensive operations of the entire war, a professional assessment that filtered down through American ranks and reinforced the particular reverence with which American soldiers regarded the Fallschirmjäger for the remainder of the conflict. The final destruction of organized German resistance in the industrial heartland of the Ruhr region in April of 1945. Where American forces encircled and eventually captured more than 300,000 German soldiers in a single massive pocket, provided American soldiers with perhaps their clearest and most overwhelming demonstration of just how completely German military power had collapsed by the war's final weeks. Field Marshal Walter Model, who commanded the trapped German forces in the Ruhr pocket, chose suicide rather than surrender when the position became hopeless. A final, grim illustration of the fanatical commitment that had characterized a portion of the German officer corps throughout the war, even as the ordinary soldiers under his command surrendered by the hundreds of thousands. American soldiers processing this enormous mass of prisoners, more Germans captured in a single battle than in almost any other engagement of the entire war, often described a surreal quality to these final days. Columns of surrendering German soldiers stretching for miles, the industrial machinery of what had once been the engine room of German war production, now silent and abandoned, and a growing recognition among the American soldiers overseeing this collapse that they were witnessing in real time, the complete and total dissolution of a military machine that had, only a year earlier at Normandy, still seemed capable of inflicting devastating casualties on any force that opposed it. The peculiar psychology of American replacement soldiers, young men who arrived in Europe as individual reinforcements to already battle-hardened units, rather than training and deploying together as cohesive groups, adds a final important layer to understanding how American attitudes toward the German army actually formed and spread through the ranks. Unlike the veteran soldiers who had accumulated their impressions of the German army gradually, campaign by campaign, replacement soldiers often arrived at the front with only the vaguest second-hand understanding of what awaited them, absorbing the accumulated wisdom, fears and prejudices of their new units within days or even hours of joining a combat formation. Veteran soldiers, hardened by months or years of fighting, often took a kind of grim responsibility for educating these replacements quickly, passing along not just tactical survival tips, but also the entire accumulated folklore of German capability and danger that the unit had developed through hard experience. Which German units in the area were considered especially dangerous, what the sound of an approaching 88mm shell meant compared to ordinary artillery, why surrendering SS soldiers required particular caution, and why certain German positions, however innocuous they appeared, should never be approached carelessly. This oral tradition of combat wisdom, passed from veteran to replacement in countless individual conversations across thousands of American units throughout the European campaign, represents one of the primary mechanisms by which the complex, hard-won understanding of the German enemy that this account has traced actually spread through the American army as a whole, ensuring that even soldiers who had personally experienced only a fraction of the war's full range of encounters with German forces nonetheless absorbed something of the broader collective wisdom their units had accumulated over years of fighting. American soldiers who served in military government and civil affairs units tasked with administering occupied German territory even before the war's formal end, developed yet another distinct vantage point on the question this account has explored, since their duties required extended, sustained contact with the German civilian population, and by extension, with returning German soldiers making the transition back into civilian life under American occupation authority. These officers, often selected specifically for language skills or pre-war familiarity with German culture, found themselves adjudicating disputes, overseeing denazification proceedings, and making countless individual judgments about which former German soldiers and officials could be trusted with responsibility in the new administrative structures being built atop the ruins of the Nazi state. This work demanded a level of individualized moral assessment that went considerably beyond the battlefield distinctions between Wehrmacht and SS that infantry soldiers had relied upon, requiring these officers to evaluate individual German soldiers and civilians on the specific merits of their wartime conduct, their level of genuine ideological commitment to Nazism, and their potential usefulness in rebuilding a functioning German society capable of eventually rejoining the community of democratic nations. The complexity and moral difficulty of this work, conducted by relatively junior American officers making consequential decisions about individual German lives with only limited information and limited time, offers a final, sobering illustration of just how difficult it proved, even for Americans directly tasked with sorting the guilty from the merely compromised, to draw clean and confident lines through the vast, varied population of German soldiers and civilians whose collective conduct during the Nazi years defied any simple, satisfying categorization. The crossing of the Rhine River itself, beyond the celebrated capture of the Remagen Bridge, involved a series of massive set-piece operations in March of 1945 that gave American and British soldiers one final large-scale demonstration of organized German defensive capability before the war's final collapse. Operation Plunder, the British and American crossing of the Rhine, north of the Ruhr, involved the largest airborne assault of the entire European war, and German forces defending the eastern bank, though badly depleted and increasingly composed of scratch formations pulled together from whatever units remained available, nonetheless inflicted significant casualties on the assaulting Allied forces, before being overwhelmed by the sheer weight of Allied numbers and firepower. American paratroopers who dropped east of the Rhine as part of this operation encountered German anti-aircraft gunners who continued firing on descending American aircraft with a determination that seemed almost willfully oblivious to the war's obviously approaching end, producing some of the last intense aerial combat casualties of the entire campaign in the West. This pattern of German gunners and infantry continuing to fight with genuine skill and lethality, even as the broader strategic picture had become hopeless beyond any reasonable doubt, reinforced yet again the complicated, contradictory nature of American soldiers' final assessment of their German adversary, an enemy whose military organization was crumbling at the strategic level, even as individual units and individual soldiers continued to demonstrate the same tactical proficiency that had characterized the German army since the very first battles in North Africa nearly 3 years earlier. The specific testimony of American tank crews who fought through the entire campaign from Normandy to the German surrender offers a particularly rich vein of material for understanding how sustained exposure to German armor shaped and reshaped American attitudes over time. Early encounters with German Panther and Tiger tanks in the hedgerows of Normandy produced a kind of respectful dread among American armored crews, a recognition that man for man and tank for tank, German armor technology in certain critical respects outclassed the standard American Sherman. Yet American tank crews also developed, over months of hard fighting, a body of tactical knowledge and a growing confidence in numbers, coordination with infantry and air support, and the sheer weight of American industrial production that gradually shifted the psychological balance even without American armor technology ever fully closing the gap in raw armor and firepower. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge, American tank crews facing German Tigers and Panthers in the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes drew on nearly 6 months of accumulated combat experience, developing coordinated tactics that used terrain, ambush positions, and close cooperation with tank destroyer units and fighter-bomber aircraft to offset the technical disadvantages their vehicles still carried. American armored officers who studied these engagements after the war often concluded that the story of American armor in the European campaign was less a story of technological parity and more a story of tactical adaptation. American crews learning to fight smarter precisely because they could not, for most of the war, fight with technically equivalent equipment. A dynamic that produced its own specific and lasting form of respect for the German armoured vehicles that had forced this adaptation in the first place. The experience of American soldiers serving in specialized reconnaissance and intelligence roles tasked with tracking German troop movements and assessing German unit strength and morale on a continuous basis throughout the campaign provides yet another dimension worth exploring in any comprehensive account of how the American military came to understand its German adversary. These soldiers, often operating in small teams well forward of the main American lines, developed an intimate, almost anthropological familiarity with the patterns and habits of specific German units they tracked over extended periods, building detailed pictures of unit morale, equipment status, and likely tactical behavior that fed directly into the operational planning of American commanders at every level. Intelligence officers compiling these reports often noted, with a kind of professional detachment that belied the human stakes involved, the gradual degradation of German unit quality as the war progressed, tracking the replacement of veteran soldiers with progressively younger, older or less well-trained replacements, and the corresponding decline in the sophistication of German tactical responses to American maneuvers. This granular intelligence work, invisible to the ordinary infantryman in his foxhole, but absolutely central to how American commanders planned and executed their campaigns, represents one of the more understudied dimensions of how the American military as an institution, as opposed to individual soldiers as private citizens in uniform, came to understand and ultimately defeat its German adversary, a process of continuous, careful observation and adaptation that mirrored at the institutional level the same process of learning and adjustment that individual American soldiers underwent in their personal encounters with the German army across nearly 3 years of combat in the European theatre. American chaplains who served alongside combat units throughout the European campaign occupied a unique position from which to observe and record the evolving moral and psychological reactions of American soldiers to their German adversaries, since soldiers often confided doubts, fears, and moral confusions to chaplains that they shared with no one else, not even close friends within their own units. Chaplains' wartime diaries and post-war reflections, preserved in various religious and military archives, reveal soldiers wrestling openly with questions that this account has traced throughout. Questions about the humanity of the enemy, the morality of killing, surrendering soldiers in the heat of vengeance after atrocities like Malmedy, and the psychological toll of reconciling respect for an enemy's courage with hatred for the cause that enemy served. Catholic chaplains in particular often found themselves counselling soldiers who struggled with guilt after killing German soldiers who had, in their final moments, called out for their mothers or prayed in ways that soldiers recognised from their own religious upbringing, moments of shared human vulnerability that cut through whatever hardened combat mentality soldiers had developed to survive the daily business of killing. These chaplains' accounts, largely absent from popular histories of the war but preserved in military archives, offer some of the most emotionally honest testimony available regarding the genuine psychological complexity American soldiers experienced in their encounters with German soldiers, testimony that reinforces from yet another angle the central argument of this account, that the American soldier's view of his German adversary was never simple, never static, and never reducible to the propaganda images that both nations' governments preferred their citizens to believe. The final surrender of German forces in May of 1945 did not arrive as a single, clean moment for the American soldiers who had spent years forming their impressions of the enemy across a dozen different campaigns and theatres. Instead, it arrived in a scattered, uneven fashion, with some units surrendering formally under negotiated terms while others simply dissolved, their soldiers discarding weapons and uniforms and attempting to blend back into the civilian population rather than face formal capture. American soldiers processing the final collapse of German military power often described a strange emotional flatness to these last days, an exhaustion so total after years of combat that the long-awaited moment of victory registered less as triumphant celebration and more as simple, bone-deep relief. Many veterans later recalled that their most vivid memories of the war's final days involved not the German soldiers surrendering in front of them, but rather the sudden, disorienting silence that fell across battlefields that had been defined by constant noise and danger for so long that soldiers had to consciously remind themselves it was finally, actually, over. In these final chaotic weeks, American soldiers encountered German officers attempting to negotiate favorable surrender terms specifically to ensure their units would fall into American rather than Soviet hands, a phenomenon that played out repeatedly across the collapsing eastern edge of the German lines, where entire German army groups raced westward specifically to surrender to the Americans and British rather than risk the vastly harsher treatment they anticipated, correctly in many documented cases, at Soviet hands. This final scramble revealed, in its own way, the reputation American forces had earned among German soldiers over the preceding years, a reputation for rough but fundamentally fair treatment that stood in the starkest possible contrast to the war of annihilation that had characterized the Eastern Front. General Dwight Eisenhower's own reflections on the German soldier, written and spoken both during and after the war, offer a useful synthesis of the complicated, evolving American view this account has traced across so many different campaigns and encounters. Eisenhower consistently maintained a clear-eyed distinction between professional respect for German military capability and unwavering moral condemnation of the cause that capability had served, a balance that many ordinary American soldiers, in their own, less articulate ways, also managed to strike even amid the chaos and trauma of combat. In his memoirs, Eisenhower wrote extensively about the technical proficiency of German staff work, the quality of German equipment in certain categories, and the genuine tactical skill displayed by German commanders at every level, assessments that mirrored the grudging respect expressed by soldiers from private to general throughout this account. Yet Eisenhower never allowed this professional assessment to soften his judgment of what the war had actually been fought over, insisting, as we have seen, that the evidence of Nazi atrocity be documented and witnessed as widely and as permanently as possible, precisely because he understood that professional respect for an enemy's military competence could too easily blur in the comfortable distance of post-war memory into something that minimized or excused the underlying moral catastrophe of the regime that competence had served. In the years and decades following the war, formal oral history projects undertaken by institutions including the National World War II Museum, the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, and numerous university archives systematically collected thousands of interviews with American veterans, preserving in far greater detail than had previously existed the full range and complexity of attitudes American soldiers had actually held toward their German adversaries. These extensive archives, many of which have only become widely accessible to researchers and the public in the Internet era, reveal a picture considerably more nuanced than the simplified narratives that dominated popular understanding of the war for much of the 20th century. Veterans interviewed in these projects, often speaking for the first time in decades about experiences they had rarely discussed even with their own families, consistently returned to the same themes that have run throughout this account. Respect for German tactical skill coexisting with horror at German atrocity, recognition of shared humanity coexisting with unwavering moral judgment, and a persistent unwillingness to reduce an enemy of millions of individual soldiers to any single, simple characterization. One veteran of the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, interviewed in his 90s decades after the war, put it about as well as anyone. You'd hate them in the morning for what they'd done to your buddy the night before, and then you'd see some kid no older than your own son crying and asking for water, and you'd feel something else entirely. Both things were true. That's just how it was. This capacity to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, without resolving them into a single tidy verdict, may be the most honest and most important legacy that these veterans' testimony leaves for anyone trying to understand what American soldiers actually thought of the German soldiers they fought against, a legacy considerably more valuable and considerably more human than any simplified narrative of pure heroism or pure villainy could ever provide. The specific case of German prisoners repatriated after years of American captivity, some not returning to Germany until well into 1946, as post-war labour shortages delayed their release, produced its own quiet coda to this larger story, one rarely discussed in popular accounts of the war, but preserved in the correspondence and records of both the American camps that held these men and the German communities that eventually welcomed them home. Many of these returning prisoners carried with them a genuinely transformed view of America and Americans, shaped by months or years of daily contact with American guards, employers, and civilians who had, in the ordinary texture of daily life far removed from combat, treated them with a decency many had not expected from a wartime enemy. Some of these former prisoners would go on to become, in the post-war decades, quiet advocates for German-American reconciliation, participating in exchange programs, business partnerships, and cultural initiatives that helped rebuild the relationship between the two nations with a speed that might have seemed impossible amid the hatred and destruction of the war's final year. This slow, unglamorous process of reconciliation, built not on grand political gestures but on the accumulated small decencies exchanged between individual soldiers, guards, farmers, and prisoners, represents perhaps the least celebrated but most consequential legacy of how American soldiers actually treated and regarded their German adversaries, a legacy that helped lay the groundwork for the deep alliance between the United States and West Germany that would define the Cold War decades that followed. It is worth returning, in these final passages, to the words of General Alfred Jodl, with which any account of German assessments of American soldiers might naturally begin, and considering their mirror image, what specifically did American generals, reflecting on the entirety of the campaign, conclude about the German army they had defeated? General Omar Bradley, writing years after the war with the benefit of considerable reflection, offered perhaps the most balanced assessment available from any senior American commander, acknowledging the German army's genuine tactical sophistication, the skill of its officer corps, and the discipline of its ordinary soldiers, while never allowing these acknowledgements to obscure his equally firm conviction that the cause this army served represented one of the great moral catastrophes in human history. Bradley's assessment, echoed in various forms by countless American soldiers of every rank who fought this war, captures the essential paradox that this entire account has traced: an enemy that could be simultaneously respected as a fighting force and condemned as an instrument of unprecedented evil, two judgments that coexisted not comfortably but honestly in the minds of the men who actually experienced this war firsthand. Judgments that resist the flattening simplicity that popular memory so often prefers, but that offer, in their very complexity, a truer and more valuable understanding of what this terrible conflict actually meant to the people who lived through it. What did American soldiers really think of German soldiers? The honest answer, drawn from the letters, diaries, interrogation reports, oral histories, and memoirs of the men who actually fought this war, is that they thought many things, often at the same time, often in apparent contradiction with each other, and often in ways that shifted dramatically depending on which German unit they faced, which atrocities they witnessed or heard about, and how many friends they had already lost by the time any particular encounter occurred. They respected the discipline and tactical skill of the Wehrmacht, even while fearing its weapons and dreading its snipers. They developed something close to a professional brotherhood with German paratroopers and fighter pilots, whose elite status mirrored their own, while reserving a special and lasting hatred for the Waffen-SS units, whose fanaticism and atrocities placed them entirely outside the bounds of ordinary soldierly respect. They pitied the boy soldiers of the Volkssturm, even as those same boys tried to kill them with Panzerfausts, and they extended genuine, documented kindness to German prisoners, even while some of their fellow soldiers shot other prisoners in retaliation for massacres like Malmedy. They recognized uncomfortably the shared humanity of young men on both sides of a war neither had chosen to start, while never losing sight, particularly after the liberation of the concentration camps, of the vast moral gulf separating the cause they fought for from the cause their enemies served. This was not confusion or inconsistency on the part of American soldiers. It was rather an honest and clear-eyed response to an enemy that was itself deeply inconsistent, a German military that contained within its ranks everything from professional soldiers simply doing an ugly job to fanatical ideologues actively perpetrating history's greatest crimes, and American soldiers, to their considerable credit, generally proved capable of telling the difference, even amid the chaos, terror, and grief of combat, even when doing so required holding multiple, contradictory truths in their minds at once. That capacity for moral clarity amid genuine complexity may be the most enduring lesson this history has to offer. Anyone seeking to understand not just what American soldiers thought of their German adversaries, but what it actually means to fight a just war against an unjust enemy without losing sight of the individual humanity, however compromised or corrupted, of the men on the other side of the wire. The role of captured German equipment in shaping American soldiers' technical assessment of their adversary deserves mention as well, since American ordnance officers and ordinary soldiers alike frequently found themselves examining, testing, and sometimes even pressing into service captured German weapons and vehicles throughout the campaign. American soldiers who captured functioning German Panther tanks sometimes used them, at least temporarily, against their former owners. And American ordnance teams conducted extensive technical evaluations of captured German equipment, ranging from small arms to advanced jet aircraft discovered in the war's final weeks, evaluations that fed directly into post-war American weapons development for decades afterward. This hands-on technical encounter with German engineering reinforced, at a very concrete and tangible level, the respect American soldiers had already developed for German technical proficiency through the harder experience of facing that equipment in combat, and many American veterans who handled captured German weapons after the war's end described a specific kind of sober appreciation for the craftsmanship involved, an appreciation that coexisted, as with so much else in this account, alongside unwavering awareness of the purposes that craftsmanship had been designed to serve. Advanced German technology discovered in the war's final months, including early jet aircraft, guided missiles, and other cutting-edge weapon systems that Germany had developed but never deployed in numbers sufficient to affect the war's outcome, left American technical officers with a lasting and somewhat unsettling respect for the sheer scientific and engineering capacity Nazi Germany had mobilized in service of its war effort, capacity that would go on to shape the post-war arms race and space race in ways that few American soldiers examining these weapons in the ruins of defeated Germany could have fully anticipated at the time. The immediate post-war interviews conducted by American historical officers attached to combat units, tasked with compiling official campaign histories while memories remained fresh, preserved some of the earliest and most unfiltered testimony available regarding how American soldiers viewed their German adversaries, testimony gathered within days or weeks of specific battles, rather than filtered through the decades of reflection that shaped later oral history projects. These contemporary interviews, conducted by historians like S.L.A. Marshall, who travelled with combat units specifically to document soldiers' immediate impressions before memory could soften or reshape them, reveal soldiers speaking with a rawness and immediacy that later accounts, however valuable, could not fully replicate. Soldiers interviewed within days of the fighting at Malmedy described their fury and disbelief with an intensity undimmed by time, while soldiers interviewed shortly after encounters with surrendering, frightened German conscripts described their sympathy with a similarly unfiltered honesty. These contemporary historical records, preserved in military archives and only gradually made available to researchers and the public in the decades since the war, provide historians today with an invaluable check against the natural tendency of memory to simplify and smooth over the genuine contradictions and complexities that this account has worked to preserve and honour, ensuring that the full, honest, complicated truth of how American soldiers actually experienced and understood their German adversaries remains available to anyone willing to sit with its considerable complexity rather than reaching for easier, tidier narratives. Even the language American soldiers used to describe their German adversaries evolved noticeably over the course of the war, offering historians a linguistic window into the shifting attitudes this account has traced. Early in the campaign, American soldiers frequently used the generic slang term "jerry," borrowed from British usage and carrying a relatively neutral, almost casual connotation, alongside kraut, a term with somewhat more contemptuous overtones rooted in old stereotypes about German cuisine. As the war progressed and American soldiers accumulated more specific, more textured experiences with different German formations, their language grew correspondingly more precise, distinguishing explicitly between the SS as a term of particular dread and contempt and ordinary references to the Germans or specific unit designations when discussing regular Wehrmacht formations encountered in less fraught circumstances. This linguistic evolution, small and easily overlooked, nonetheless mirrors the broader argument threaded throughout this entire account that American soldiers' understanding of their enemy grew steadily more sophisticated and more differentiated the longer and more extensively they fought, moving from the simple, undifferentiated categories of pre-war propaganda toward the complicated, granular, and ultimately more honest understanding that combat experience, however terrible its cost, tends to produce in soldiers who survive long enough to develop it. In the end, the men who fought this war left behind a record considerably wiser and more honest than the simplified myths later generations sometimes prefer. A record worth preserving in its full, uncomfortable complexity, precisely because that complexity reflects the truth of what actually happened on the battlefields of Europe between 1942 and 1945. That is the story this account has tried to tell, honestly and without flinching from its many contradictions, because the men who lived it deserve nothing less than the full truth of what they actually saw, felt, and came to understand about the soldiers they fought against for nearly 3 long years. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our video about what German generals actually thought of their Allied counterparts, where we explored how figures like Alfred Jodl and Heinz Guderian assessed commanders like Patton, Montgomery, and Eisenhower from across the very same battle lines. You might also enjoy our deep dive into what happened to Germany's generals after the war ended, tracing the trials, imprisonments, and surprising second careers of the men who commanded the very armies discussed in this video. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.